Thank you very much, Salam and Asma. Wonderful introductory, welcoming speeches. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Congresswoman Jayapal and Harris Tarrant, Vice President of MPAC, to introduce the Congresswoman. I don't think she needs any introduction, but we thought that she deserves an introduction.
Good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you. I have the privilege of introducing Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and I'll keep it really short. I know she's on a tight schedule. The Congresswoman represents Washington's 7th District, which encompasses most of Seattle, Washington. She is the first South Asian American woman elected to Congress. She sits on the Judiciary Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee and on the Budget Committee. And just a note, she's got many accolades and accomplishments in Congress. But I do want to say that two things that she did that ties her domestic and foreign policy work, which is absolutely amazing. Just this week, she introduced the resolution recognizing the 3 years of war and starvation in the Sudan, and encouraged a bipartisan group of members of Congress to recognize the genocide in Sudan and to bring attention and relief, especially humanitarian aid to Sudan. And she also, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, was a leader on the in the anti-Sharia hearings that Salam just mentioned, and she was absolutely brilliant in pushing back against the bigoted members of Congress like Chip Roy and Keith Self and others, and ensuring that American Muslims are a part and parcel of this country, and pushing back against the falsification of Sharia being against U.S. Constitution and U.S. law. So we welcome the Congresswoman.
Good morning, assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me today to the Muslim Public Affairs Council and the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. This is a very consequential moment for this conference, and I deeply appreciate all of the speakers that I saw on your program that are here. Experts who track democratic backsliding around the world, including in the United States, have measured a dramatic decline in democracy around the world. And here at home, as we get ready, as was mentioned, to celebrate our 250th anniversary of the birth of this nation and our grand ideals for a more perfect union, the Century Foundation, along with many other groups, found that US democracy is at greater risk than at any time since Watergate and approaching the pre-civil rights era low point. That assessment came before the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act and ruled that essentially racial gerrymandering is perfectly fine as long as you couch it as partisan gerrymandering. That shocking ruling not only overturns a struggle for freedom and democracy in this country that was hard fought for hundreds of years, a struggle that so many generations gave their lives for, a struggle that Dr. Martin Luther King died for. But it also outlines all of the challenges that we have as we look forward. Trump and his administration have worked in both his first term and his current term to delegitimize elections, to expand executive power, to weaken voting rights, to weaponize state agencies for their own power, to erode all of our constitutional rights, and to put unprecedented pressure on civil institutions, from universities to the media. Our democracy was built on this very core idea that a balance of powers would prevent any authoritarian or dictator from taking over too much power. So the idea was that you would have these three branches of government. And for those who say they're co-equal, let me just point out that Congress is Article 1 of the Constitution, and a much bigger article than Article 2, which is presidential power. But the idea was that Congress, the judiciary, and the executive branch are each assigned powers that theoretically would balance each other out and would provide that check and balance on any one branch taking excessive power. And our founders were very smart, but unfortunately they were not all-knowing. They assumed that giving that check and balance would mean that the majority party would take the powers that were assigned to them and uphold those powers, even if it meant countering the executive from your own party. When you have a majority party, however, in Congress that has essentially become a cult party of an authoritarian leader and refuses to stand up for the powers that are articulated in Article 1 of the Constitution, the power to declare war, the sole power to authorize funding for agencies across the country, then that check fails. When you have a party that refuses to indict and hold accountable a sitting president for trying to steal an election or incite an insurrection, as Donald Trump did in 2020, you create the very condition that we are facing today. Jack Smith, special counsel in the January 6th investigation, when he was testifying before Congress, I asked him, what is the result of refusing to hold a president accountable for inciting an insurrection and trying to steal an election? He said it's catastrophic. It's catastrophic because it allows for that to happen again. If there isn't accountability the first time, it can happen again. So let's look at the second branch of government, or one of the three branches of government, and that is the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court of the land is overtaken by a right-wing majority of justices who have no transparency or accountability, only court in the land that has no ethics, accountable ethics law that governs them, and these justices cater to their biggest donors who appear before them in court decisions, who lure them with luxury RVs or expensive vacations, and a purely partisan ideological viewpoint that allows for the overturning of decisions like the Voting Rights Act, like the freedom to make choices about your own body, whatever those decisions have been, to overturn precedents mean that that check of the Supreme Court and the judiciary also falls through. I was trapped in the gallery on January 6th. I was right there, just one of a few dozen members of Congress who was not able to get out of the gallery when others did. And I, to this day, remember the pounding of the insurrectionists on the door, and I remember that I did not know if I would make it out alive, simply for doing my job and certifying a fair and free election. And yet, Donald Trump was allowed to get away with it, and now has weaponized the entire Department of Justice to pardon more than 1,500 January 6th insurrectionists who were charged with crimes, and has even allowed them to sue the government for your taxpayer dollars for retribution. The DOJ under this administration has become a personal revenge agency, not the attorney for the people, but the attorney for only the president, indicting people who disagree with them or challenge them, including members of Congress, like my own colleague, Representative LaMonica McIver, who was simply doing oversight of an immigration facility, which, by the way, is in our purview and authority to do. He has sued media organizations for airing truths and reporting the news. He has bullied and threatened the funding of universities, too many of whom have caved and eliminated entire programs and faculty with a focus on the Middle East, simply because they espouse views that may be contrary to his administration on Israel and Palestine. He has used the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security to discriminate against immigrants and those who seek to come here as visitors, denying entry to or attacking, jailing, and deporting pro-Palestinian students, researchers, and doctors like Rumeysa Ozturk and Mahmoud Khalil, simply for exercising free speech rights, which are built into our Constitution. And ICE and CBP have turned into completely unconstitutional agencies, that have terrorized entire communities, killed US citizens in our streets, and are jailing over 70,000 people every single night in immigrant incarceration facilities, regardless of immigration status. US citizens, legal permanent residents, people with valid visas, every single night, 70,000 people. Those mass detention policies have been ruled illegal by over 420 judges across the country, including a majority of judges who were appointed by Donald Trump. So this is not a partisan issue in terms of our unconstitutional actions of this administration and the attempts to hold him accountable that are still pursued and prevailing in many cases through the lower courts. Racial profiling has been used as a tool with the Supreme Court's blessing. And the reenactment of racist and anti-Muslim policies like the Muslim travel ban have also contributed to restricting asylum and TPS for those who need it. Immigration processing, I serve as the top Democrat on the immigration subcommittee. I hope to be chair come November. But on immigration, what we've seen is a complete slowing of all processing, of all legal applications. In fact, there was recently a study put out by the Cato Institute that said that the Trump administration has cracked down on legal immigration twice as much as on undocumented immigration. So let's be clear that this is an attempt to rid us of all immigrants, regardless of immigration status. Immigration is, in many ways, in my view, a testing ground. If you can get away with this for immigrants, then you can extend it to all people, as we see with the efforts around denaturalization. The authoritarian actions are not just here in the United States. From the illegal war in Iran, a war started as Donald Trump invited Benjamin Netanyahu into the Situation Room, an unprecedented event, to the extrajudicial killings of blowing up boats in the Caribbean, the overthrowing of Maduro in Venezuela, the threats to take Cuba with military action, and the continued arming of the Israeli government in committing a genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. Trump is acting with complete immunity on all of these things from Congress. I know how deeply the Muslim community has felt the effects of all of this backsliding. In fact, many of you have said that to me this morning. And the shameful rise of the blatant anti-Muslim bigotry that runs directly counter to our country's foundational value of religious freedom. And so yes, I did have to take on all of that in the so-called anti-Sharia hearing that we had this week in Judiciary, and I hope you have a chance to watch some of those clips because it makes it very clear that all of this is designed to attack Muslims as a whole, to attack the core principle of religious freedom that is built into our Constitution, and to promote a negative vision of Islam and Muslims in this country, despite all of the contributions of Muslims, along with so many other religious groups to our country. It is also an attempt to distract from the real problems that face Americans today. The rising cost of gas, the rising price of groceries, the fact that 90 million Americans in the United States of America do not have health care in the richest country in the world. The fact that $220 billion of medical debt is a burden for so many Americans across this country. But you see, if you read Project 2025, you saw a very clear racist, fascist, white supremacist agenda throughout Project 2025. So in some ways, I am not shocked that we are seeing what we're seeing. It was notified to us in that document. Last year, Donald Trump sent a letter to 60 universities threatening to cut federal funding over pro-Palestinian organizing by student groups. And between that and his anti-DEI crusade, multiple universities have seen billions of dollars cut, frozen, or suspended, some of which was only restored after they settled with Trump or successfully fought back in court and obtained orders blocking these lawless actions. But this type of civil pressure is a hallmark of democratic backsliding. And the idea that we would rewrite the entire history of the United States to eliminate our history of slavery, of oppression against indigenous people, of all of the things that have happened in this country that have made us better for who we are because we took those things on is an attempt to undercut the very values of this country. All of these steps being taken here at home are deeply concerning on their face, but they're more so when taken into account with this administration's fondness of dictators abroad like Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban. Since 2010, when he took power, Orban's government has rewritten their constitution, packed the courts and the media with his loyalists, and weakened judicial independence, changed election rules, and pressured civil society to fall in line. And all of that has meant less freedoms for the Hungarian people as Orban consolidated power. But I bring the example of Hungary into the room specifically because I think it is a hopeful example of what people's movements across the country can do. Certainly what we saw in Arab Spring, what we saw in Sudan for a few brief years, and now what we saw in Hungary, when the people took their futures and their freedom into their own hands and voted Orban out of office, ending a decade of his leadership and grip of power. This change is, to me, a proof point of what we also know from countries around the world that face authoritarian leaders. Stopping the slide into authoritarianism will not come from legislation, as much as I respect our role as members of Congress. It won't come from the courts, as much as I respect the judiciary. It is not defeated by one person, one institution, or one event. It is ultimately defeated by the strength of people's movements that rise up, that grow in their conviction and their ability to take risks and build our collective refusal to comply with an authoritarian leader. We know that thanks to the organizing happening across the country in small and large communities, to bring attention to the abuses of this administration and to bring people from every political ideology together to fight for those values that made America so great. There are millions of people now who voted for Donald Trump who regret their support for him. His polling sits at an all-time low, including on issues like immigration and the economy that have traditionally been his strong points. And the war in Iran is incredibly popular. Just witnessed this week our War Powers resolution in both the House and the Senate. Yes, failed, but failed by one vote. So we have Republicans who are beginning to understand the seriousness of the moment and to want to exercise those constitutional authorities. 60% of Americans now disapprove of Israel's actions in Gaza, and increasing numbers do not want the United States to continue arming Israel in violation of our own domestic and international humanitarian laws. I cannot say that the path forward is easy, but what I have learned through decades of organizing, going back to 9/11 and the work I did right after 9/11 to address the discrimination and hate and violation and abuses against Muslims, South Asians, and others, both inside and outside of Congress, is that dictators and authoritarians are only propped up by the powers that we give them. Power does not flow from the top down. It only flows from the bottom up. And that is the strength of our time. They are defeated by people's movements that recognize that courage is not acting when we are not afraid. It is acting despite our fears. The willingness to act nonviolently, to take risks nonviolently, is absolutely critical. And that is why I launched a series of trainings called Resistance Lab. You can check it out at resistancelab.us. They're virtual trainings that train people on how effective nonviolent people's movements can address authoritarians and democratic backsliding. We have now trained over 30,000 people in all 50 states across the country. And it has been some of the most hopeful work that I have done in the last year. The thing I will leave you with is hope is a discipline. It has to be practiced every day. And we have to work at it every single day. Because in the end, hopelessness and powerlessness are tools of the oppressor. And our work is to refuse to allow that to win, to learn from these movements around the world, in Sudan, in Brazil, in so many other places, where people's movements have taken on authoritarians and dictators and won. because I really believe, and maybe this is my history as a longtime organizer, whether I'm outside or inside Congress, that it is that strength of people's movements that keep democracy strong. That is the strength that fought for and won civil rights in this country, that fought for and abolished slavery in this country. It is that work that pushed legislation forward. And so I leave you with that thought, that our work is to make sure that we continue to practice the discipline of hope, the discipline of resistance, and that we work together to celebrate a 250th anniversary that befits the founding ideals of this country as a great democracy, the greatest democracy in the world. Thank you all so much.